Social mores, that is the behavior which is acceptable in a given societal group, vary from culture to culture and change over time, often dramatically. What is polite action in one society might be a grave insult in another. For example, Americans appreciate a good hearty handshake, but in some Eastern cultures that's a sign of aggression. In China and Taiwan, it is considered a compliment to the chef if you belch after a meal. But I can assure you, when I made that excuse as a child, my mother was not amused, although I think my dad appreciated it. When we want to relax, we put our feet up, but in the Middle and Far East, displaying your feet like that is considered to be an insult. You wouldn't think twice about shaking hands with a member of the opposite sex, but Orthodox Jews and strict Muslims would only do so if it's a family member. In Japan and Korea, offering a tip is an insult because asking for a tip is akin to begging. The okay sign, while meaning nothing much here other than that you're okay with something, is an insult in Germany and South America. While in the UK, the peace sign is an insult when the palm is turned inward. Lastly, to show your open palm to someone, like waving goodbye or gesturing stop, is very offensive in Greece. A list like this could go on and on. In our world today, thanks to American television and movies, much of this sort of simple misunderstanding is evaporating because of cross-cultural exposure, and of course also because of the rise of global travel. Well, that's fine and good for life for today. We're understanding each other better than we were before. But it doesn't really help us understand a scenario that is far removed from us by time, something from ancient history, especially when we add a cultural barrier to it. In our text today, Naomi will suggest and Ruth will carry out a plan that Matthew Henry, the great commentator from the 18th century, said was very extraordinary and suspicious. Is this just a case of cultural misunderstanding? Ancient Jewish cultural mores were certainly very different than ours. The question is, how different were they really? So as we look at our text today, we will try to understand Naomi's plan and look at it from that perspective. So beginning in the first 4 verses of chapter 3 of the book of Ruth, it says, "One day Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, 'My daughter, should I not try to find a home for you, where you will be well provided for? Is not Boaz, with whose servant girls you have been, a kinsman of ours? Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash and perfume yourself and put on your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he does lie down, note the place where he is lying. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do.'" So thus we see Naomi's plan. She begins by saying, "My daughter-in-law, I need to find a home for you." The kindness of Boaz, which we learned about last week, has helped Ruth and Naomi take a step back from extreme poverty, as has Ruth's ongoing willingness to work hard. But the overall circumstances for these two widows will continue to remain precarious until Ruth is able to remarry. In our world today, Ruth could find a job. She could support herself and only remarry eventually if she chose to seek out a new husband. But in the ancient Middle East, economically as well as culturally, that just isn't an option. In order to be safe, in order to do anything more than survive in a subsistence agriculture economy, Ruth needs a husband. In addition, the idea of remaining childless, while really unremarkable today, was a cultural taboo that carried with it shame that Ruth certainly does not deserve. For comparison, remember the bitterness of Hannah, who was a contemporary of Ruth. She had a loving and kind husband, but cried out to God in her bitterness, in her distress, because she lacked a child. All of those factors point to this need. The Hebrew that we have translated here as a home is literally find rest. Naomi said to her, "My daughter, I must find rest for you." Naomi is telling Ruth that she needs to find a rest restful state. In other words, a status of marriage that puts to rest fear and anxiety. She needs a place of peace. Doesn't really seem how marriage is described today, does it? Certainly not on a sitcom, and not often enough in real life. Society tends to view marriage today through the prism of divorce, because it is not considered to be a permanent agreement by so many people. How can they be at rest if uncertainty about the future of the marriage is always in play? You see, God intended marriage to be our rest, our home sweet home, literally. If it isn't, the fault lies with us. Continue with the text. Naomi says, "It's not Boaz, whose servant girls you've been with, a kinsman of ours." We learned last week in chapter 2, verse 20, that Boaz is a kinsman-redeemer regarding the line of Naomi's late husband, Elimelech. As a close male relative, he has an opportunity/obligation under the law of Moses to redeem the property of Elimelech and to marry the childless widow in order to raise up a son to inherit Elimelech's property and maintain his family name. In other words, neither the property nor the son will technically belong to the man who performs the duty of the kinsman-redeemer. It is an act of charity on his part, which aside from the honor of having done the right thing, goes unrewarded, unless of course the widow herself is a reward, as a woman like Ruth would be because of her virtue. In most cases, for a kinsman-redeemer, virtue is its own reward, however. Because Boaz has shown great kindness in the small things, and he is technically a kinsman-redeemer, Naomi has decided to take matters into her own hands and through Ruth force the issue in the hopes that he will accept. So she says to her daughter-in-law, "Tonight he will be winnowing barley, wash, perfume yourself, get in your best, go to the threshing floor, lie down next to him and uncover his feet." Oops, I went too far ahead. But don't let him know you're there. Naomi tells Ruth to go visit Boaz at his farm, where he and his workers have been finishing the harvest process by threshing the grain. It was customary to follow up that culmination of the harvest with a feast. And given Boaz's generosity to his workers, we can assume that they were all in good spirits. It was to this celebration that Naomi is sending Ruth, dressed in her best clothes and looking her best, to present herself to Boaz, although Naomi cautions Ruth not to do so publicly, which would have put Boaz on the spot, but instead to wait until after the feast has ended. She finishes by telling her when he lies down, note the place, then go uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do. Naomi knows that Boaz will remain near his crop this evening as the owner, to protect it from would-be thieves until the harvest can be transferred to storage and or the excess taken to market. The issue of cultural misunderstanding begins here, where Naomi tells Ruth to uncover Boaz's feet and lie down next to him until he wakes up. What does this mean? What is Naomi hoping to accomplish? From our perspective, telling a young woman to dress up, look her best, and go lie down next to a man she is hoping to soon marry seems like an extremely provocative act. An act that has, frankly, a sexual enticement angle to it. It is possible that Naomi, given the cultural context, was following the social mores of her day and simply assuming that Boaz, as a kinsman-redeemer, is technically already the husband of Ruth, if he chooses, before God. So, because of the stipulations of the Levirate marriage custom that they all were familiar with, which would make an actual marriage ceremony of little necessity to complete their nuptials. Maybe that's her line of thinking. Following that line of thought, we would conclude that, as Matthew Henry did 300 years ago, the thing did not look so ill then as it does now. Perhaps Naomi's plan thus included nothing improper, a conclusion we will have to revisit when we see how Ruth fulfills the plan and Boaz's reaction to it. One final note before we look at what Ruth did in response to Naomi's plan. Naomi tells Ruth to leave the next step, once Boaz awakens, to find her next to him, up to Boaz, which tells us that Naomi is assuming that Boaz will understand what this gesture is supposed to mean, even if we don't. As a further note, the original Hebrew text is purposefully vague throughout this passage, not offering us clarity on its own regarding the motive of Naomi. So what do we have? Best case scenario, she is instructing Ruth to symbolically complete the kinsman-redeemer relationship. Worst case scenario, she wants Ruth to appeal to an old man's physical desire for a younger woman. Those are the two choices. Let's look at what the text says happened in verses 5 through 9. I will do whatever you say, Ruth answered. So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking, he was in good spirits, and he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man, and he turned and discovered a woman lying at his feet. Who are you? He asked. I am your servant Ruth, she said. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a kinsman-redeemer. So Ruth says, I will do what you say, and she follows through. She goes, approaches Boaz quietly, and uncovers his feet. And so we have Ruth, looking her best, awaiting the response of Boaz to finding her at his feet when he awakens. This feels like a situation that could go horribly wrong. What if Boaz understandably freaks out when he awakens and realizes he's not alone? Some of us would do that, right? You see someone next to you when you wake up, you'd punch that person because you have no idea who it is. What if Boaz has no intention of fulfilling the kinsman-redeemer role? What if Boaz seizes the opportunity to take advantage of Ruth? It seems, at least to us, a very risky plan. So in the middle of the night, something startled him, and he turned to discover a woman lying at his feet. Who are you? He asked. Without the constant artificial light that lights up the night, believe me, living across from sheets, I'm aware of the fact that there is no true darkness. Boaz had no way of knowing, though, who was at his feet when he awoke. For most of us, awaking to find someone next to you would be an awful fright. The NIV, our translation, calls Boaz's reaction startled, which is the best thing that you can do with the Hebrew verb, because the Hebrew verb simply says, he turned himself. What does that mean? Well, the ancient Jewish commentary, the Targum, paints a more colorful picture here. It says, the man trembled, and his flesh became like a boiled turnip through fear. Actually, I have no idea what a boiled turnip looks like, but that seems like a picture. Now, we don't count the Targum as an authoritative source for understanding the Scriptures, but it is a window into how the Old Testament text was understood among the Babylonian Jewish community who created this commentary. And they did so after the exile, which would be about halfway between these events that are recorded in the birth of Christ. It also helps us bridge the cultural gap between the ancient Judaism and ourselves, because the Targum's writers were themselves Jews, and they were living far closer in time to what they're commenting upon than we are several thousand years later. So that's a lot of the explanation I know about the Targum, but in your own Old Testament studies you may come across a reference, the Targum says this, the Targum says that, about a particular text. And I want you to know that their opinion is worth listening to, especially when it gives us a memorable picture, like Boaz's skin acting like a boiled turnip. That gives us something to think about. Now, asking, who are you, is the obvious things to say, but it's still a great question. At this point, Boaz is wondering why a woman has approached his place of sleeping, only to lie down near him and wait for him to wake up. Seems like something that requires an explanation. Here's Ruth's explanation. I am your servant Ruth. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a kinsman-redeemer. Ruth, who just recently told Boaz, I do not have the standing of one of your servant girls, now refers to herself as a servant of Boaz. Now, she's not using the word to call herself inferior, like you're the boss, I'm the servant. She's actually claiming a higher status than she had previously when she was simply a foreign widow. Ruth can say that with confidence to Boaz, in large part because of the relationship that has been established between them, because of his ongoing kindness to her. When Ruth asks Boaz to spread the corner of your garment over me, We're once again against a cultural barrier that makes understanding here difficult. Is that some sort of idiom in Hebrew that we don't understand? What would it mean? Is she telling him literally to cover her with part of his robe? Or is this some sort of elaborate metaphor? Part of the answer lies with a literal rendering of the Hebrew. The thing that Ruth is literally asking Boaz to spread over her is actually his wing. Of course, Boaz has no wing. It's a metaphor. It means his garment. But it also reminds us, back a few chapters ago, what Boaz said to Ruth. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Thus we have Ruth taking Boaz's own words and repeating them back to him, using his own metaphor and asking him for protection. She explains why. Because he is a kinsman-redeemer. She is not at all subtly reminding him, FYI, you are a kinsman-redeemer. In the end, the scenario is unorthodox, and Naomi's plan is odd, if not suspicious to us. But the point gets through to Boaz clearly. Ruth is asking him to marry her. That may be the weirdest marriage proposal you've ever heard of. And ladies, let us not imitate this. I would not recommend this approach. But as a kinsman-redeemer, Boaz understands his cultural and moral obligations. So now the question is, will he fulfill it? Verses 10 through 13. The Lord bless you, my daughter, he replied. This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, do not be afraid. I will do for you all you ask. All my fellow townsmen know that you are a woman of noble character. Although it is true that I am near of kin, there is a kinsman-redeemer nearer than I. Stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to redeem, good. Let him redeem. But if he is not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. Lie here until morning. Boaz says, the Lord bless you. This kindness is greater than before because you have not run after a young man. Boaz is at least very flattered by Ruth's desire to marry him, in part because he didn't really consider himself to be a viable candidate for such a young widow, because he's an older man. Boaz, as we've speculated earlier, belongs to Elimelech's generation, like Naomi, not to Ruth's. He may not have approached Ruth previously in the role of a kinsman-redeemer simply because no man wants to have a young woman laugh at him as a fool for pursuing her. He probably assumed she would laugh and say, no, you're an old man. It's very likely that Boaz is himself a widower, childbirth being exceedingly dangerous and usually the leading cause of death amongst women in the ancient world. Boaz probably has grown children, his own son to inherit his estate. He wasn't thinking of himself as a potential husband for Ruth. Surely she would want to marry a young man instead. And yet, Ruth and Naomi have seen the high quality of Boaz's character, far more important a factor than his age. And so Boaz may now have a second chance at marriage, if indeed this is his second chance, something he probably gave up on years ago. So he says to her, don't be afraid, I will do for you all you ask. Everyone knows you're a woman of noble character. Ruth has nothing to fear from Boaz. He has no intention of dishonoring himself or her by not following the entirety of the law of God. If this situation was any part, if any of this was a lustful temptation for Boaz, he has denied it. The Targum's commentary compares Boaz here to Joseph, when Joseph ran from Potiphar's wife to deny her advances. The Targum says that Boaz subdued his lust. In the end, however we decide to understand Naomi's plan and how Ruth carried it out, whether it was 100% innocent or had some shades of gray in it, it doesn't really matter to Boaz. For he has decided, and it only took him a moment, think about that, it only took him a second for him to decide, despite his shock at awakening to find Ruth there and her proposal of marriage, He does the right thing in just a moment. Boaz was impressed that Ruth chose him. He considered it to be a kindness even greater than her loyalty to Naomi. But he doesn't want to marry her just because she's young. Boaz, as a man of noble character, is impressed that Ruth is a woman of noble character. As such, only a fool would turn her down. However, he says, although I am near of kin, there is one nearer than I, and he must be given his chance. There's just that one catch. As eager as Boaz is to marry Ruth, now that he knows that she actually wants to marry him, he cannot violate his conscience by shortchanging the cultural rules for a kinsman-redeemer. It may seem like a minor point, and one that we'd be tempted to bend if we were in his shoes. But Boaz refuses this temptation as well. He will not seek happiness at the expense of his own moral code, or at the expense of the man who is closer in relationship to Elimelech. There is a significant lesson for our culture in Boaz's actions. Too often we hear of people who elevate the pursuit of happiness above morality, as if because it makes me happy is a legitimate excuse for immoral behavior. Boaz was faced this evening with two types of temptation, both of which he overcame. The first was sudden and unlooked for, when he awoke to find Ruth nearby. It was not of his making. He did not enter into that temptation, but he did face it and prevail. The second was more subtle. Boaz had time to think ahead, to realize that a conflict existed that might short-circuit his desire. He could have taken steps to act dishonestly. He could have ignored that other claimant, hoping the problem would simply go away on its own. But Boaz resisted this subtle form of temptation as well. Blessed indeed is a person who can resist, by the grace of God, multiple forms of temptation. Boaz does tell Ruth to stay until morning, a measure taken for her safety, lest something happen as she walks alone at night home. And lastly, he also gives Ruth his solemn word, punctuating it with the name of the Lord as a witness to his commitment to Ruth, if the other man of closer kin to Elimelech declines to marry Ruth. A little bit more in our text today. Verse 14 says, So she lay at his feet until morning, but got up before anyone could be recognized. And he said, Don't let it be known that a woman came to the threshing floor. She lay at his feet until morning, but got up beforehand. Boaz was aware enough of how gossip begins that he had Ruth return home at first light, lest her reputation be unjustly besmirched by those who would assume that Ruth and Boaz could not spend a chaste night in close proximity to each other. It's important to protect the reputation of those who are disciples of Christ from false rumor and innuendo. I think especially of teenage girls, especially in our culture, a culture that does not cringe nearly enough at the notion of sexting, because it is far too busy exploiting sexuality for advertising and entertainment. It's incumbent upon us as parents of these young people especially, but also as the rest of you, the responsible adults in their lives, to help them see the danger of a reputation that is sullied. Gossip may fade over time, but guess what? Social media can keep such things alive for the rest of your life. We must, like Boaz, keep watch over those who are vulnerable to slander. Concluding with 15 through 18, he also said, Bring me the shawl you're wearing and hold it out. When she did so, he poured into it 6 measures of barley and put it on her. Then he went back to town. When Ruth came to her mother-in-law, Naomi asked, How did it go, my daughter? Then she told her everything Boaz had done for her, and added, He gave me these 6 measures of barley, saying, Don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed. Then Naomi said, Wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today. So on the way back, Boaz gives her 6 measures to take with her, and then he returns to town. Boaz didn't send Ruth back to Naomi empty-handed. Instead, as a demonstration of his earnestness The earnestness of his promise to deal with this matter this very day, he gives her a significant amount of barley, enough that he needed to help Ruth by placing the load on her head so that she could carry it. That being accomplished, Boaz heads into Bethlehem to seek out his relative concerning Ruth. Next week we will see that conversation and find out if Boaz is successful. Notice that Boaz didn't send Ruth to seek that man out. He has taken ownership of her cause now, and also would not want her to face the potential humiliation of being rejected by a man she doesn't know. Plus, by going himself, Boaz will demonstrate his own interest in Ruth to his relative. There is, I'm sure, important work for him to do this day on the farm. They just finished the harvest. I'm sure he had plans. But in Boaz's mind, such things can wait. The question of whether or not he's going to marry Ruth is now priority number one. So Ruth goes home, and Naomi wants to know how it went. Ruth relates to Naomi the events of the previous evening, Boaz's reaction and promise, as well as his new gift of barley. Perhaps Naomi was expecting the matter to be resolved already. She may have forgotten about that closer relative, or she may have expected Boaz to ignore that guy. But will she consider what Ruth is relating to her to be good news? She certainly does. She says, wait, he will not rest until the matter is settled today. Naomi interprets the news as very good indeed. There is uncertainty about this other claimant. Perhaps he's a man of honor. Maybe not. We don't know. Maybe he will be interested in Ruth. Maybe not. To await an answer like that would have been difficult. Nobody likes to wait when you don't know if the news is going to be good or bad. But at least Naomi is telling Ruth, you're not going to have to wait long. Between the gift and the oath, Naomi knows that Boaz very much wants to marry Ruth. One way or another, the answer will be here soon. And so what do we make of this? Part 4 from the book of Ruth. A few thoughts. Naomi's plan, scandalous or not, we can't be sure, was at least a risky one. Not really the kind of thing that we ought to emulate. Playing with fire gets burned eventually, even if it worked out for Ruth and Naomi. Secondly, Boaz's response to both types of temptation is exactly what we ought to be emulating. He was not willing to take a shortcut. He was not willing to put pleasure over propriety. And he was not willing to risk either Ruth's safety or her reputation. Not everyone in the Bible should be emulated. Even great heroes like David had horrific flaws too. But Boaz has proven himself time and time again to be above reproach. May we all likewise resist temptation and embrace righteousness. Lastly, we've not mentioned the providence of God at work in this particular message, but rest assured it is still operating in the background. God brought Ruth to Boaz's field for a very significant reason. Next week, as we conclude Ruth, we will see the grace and love of the plan of God on display once again.